we have been in touch, and I'm very interested in all the work that Jacqueline does. And in particular, the first book I read from Jacqueline was a collection of interviews and essays about the creation of the Bears Ears National Monument. So natural resource management from an indigenous perspective is one of the issues that Jacqueline has written about extensively. And so thank you so much for being here.
Back in 2017, I did a book about Bears Ears National Monument, and I was citizen of the Navajo Nation. My mother's Navajo, and my father's Yankton Sioux. So I'm also Dakota, and Lakota. There's like that in my country as well. But yeah, they. So it was really interesting to talk to Native people from 5 different tribes that work collaboratively through a system of complete, ascent to create a monument to preserve an area that was sacred to all of the tribes, and in the area that in my own clan, the Navajo way, we introduce ourselves by our clans, and we're matrilineal. So each of your clans comes from your grandparents, but the one you inherit is your maternal grandmother's clan, which become my Shigasama, and my grandmother, and so. So my clan is Kia'ani, Towering House. So that's the clan I am a member of. But I am born for my father's people, the Yahantuan Dakota people, and my Che, my mother's father, was Hashka'azo, Yakafru clan, and of course my Dakota grandfather was also Yankton Sioux Yahantuan. So that's how we. Introduce ourselves in Navajo. And I did have the opportunity when I first graduated from college to go work on the Navajo Nation as a community organizer, and that was really amazing because I was in Eastern Navajo. My family is from Western Navajo in Cameron near the Grand Canyon, and so going to the other part of the Navajo Nation was a huge education to me, and it was wonderful to see how beautiful our nation is. It's the Navajo Nation is the size of Ireland, so it's a pretty large nation, and we have about 400,000 enrolled members, and so and a lot of first speakers. So I think it's about 170,000 still speak the language. So it's like a country. I always say it's like a country within a country. It's about the size of Iceland, really, in population and everything. So it's like as if Iceland was in the middle of the United States and no one knew about it and stuff. So that was a really amazing experience for me to work on that. And I originally split the book into 3. I had poetry. I invited Native poets to contribute it, and then I had essays that I wrote, and also I invited other people to write, and really discussing sort of land management policies, like how do we manage land, particularly that is not on our reservations, that is part of what in treaties they often call our sort of our cultural resources, places where our common places where we would go gather, or have kind of origin stories. I think Bears Ears in southeastern Utah, which is in San Juan County, is kind of the first place where they say that they first really saw the modern Navajo people, Zuni people, Utes, and all of these nations, and the Hopi, they all sort of first emerged there. It's sort of like the Fertile Crescent, where we first became ourselves. And so there are old towers around Towers, Minnesota, which they think is the origin of my clan name, Kia'ani, Towering House. So it's just a really precious place for us. So it's really great to write about it and how members of these 5 tribes work collaboratively and shared things. They shared things. I think there's a lot of tribes in the Southwest, and they're culturally very strong, but they don't have a lot of historic trust amongst each other, and they don't generally share their traditions with each other, like their sacred things. So the process of them putting together this proposal for a national monument basically was the first time they had sat together and really shared these things with each other. So it was a really amazing experience, and it was, I think, the first national monument that was really proposed by these consortium of tribes. And of course, Trump, the first thing he did was try to get rid of it, but it's still there, and actually thanks to him, it's actually larger now, because the original area and then this other area he created. So yeah, so it's been really interesting. So still covering that issue, particularly with mining. My next book I have coming out is about, it's called Letters to Oppenheimer, and it's a series of letters I wrote to Oppenheimer, Robert Oppenheimer, about the creation of the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb. Of course, a lot of which took place in the Southwest. And as a community organizer, I not only worked in Eastern Navajo, but also won Pueblo communities there along the Rio Grande. And just to see how it impacted their lands. I was just back in Jemez last year, visiting families there that I got to know. And it's, so it's, I grew up in Richland, Washington. My father was an engineer. And so I really wanted to look at how the Manhattan Project impacted Native people, Native communities. And it's on many levels. And of course, you're also looking at indigenous communities of course, in the Pacific that were bombed, many couldn't return home because of the atomic, the nuclear radiation. And so it's been a lot of fun to write, but it's actually, my topics are not necessarily fun, but it's been really interesting to write about and stuff. So, and the uranium mining takes place all over the United States, even in Lakota territories around the Black Hills and many other places. And while I was working on this book, I lost my aunt to cancer, and she is, officially the government recognizes her as a downwinder, someone who was impacted by uranium mining and died. So she died at 62, so we lost her much earlier than we would have. And so that's something that continues to impact our communities. So this is book, Standoff. In January 2016, I started covering for Indian Country Day the standoff here in Burns at the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, and I didn't know a lot about the Paiute people, so it was a huge education for me, and I was really honored to be able to talk to a lot of people from the tribe and learn so much, and I'm very humbled because I just, what I had to learn was, just because I'm American Indian doesn't mean I know everything about every community or every people, and so I go into communities, very aware of that, and not thinking that I'm just there to listen, and to promote their voices. And so, then I ended up in December 2016 at Standing Rock, and my grandmother, her grandparents lived on Standing Rock for 40 years. We're yanked in Dakota, but there are Yankees that have settled in Standing Rock Reservation because they got land there. But really, her family were there as Episcopal ministers, and and her grandfather was the Reverend P.J. Deloria, and he was actually made a Hunka brother by Chief Gall, and then so they served the communities there at Standing Rock for 40 years. 8 different communities are going around on, in bad weather and everything to serve them, and so they were deeply beloved there. And then of course her uncle was the Reverend Vi Deloria Sr., and he was the Episcopal minister in Pine Ridge. And then her uncle on her father's side, her father's older brother, was also an Episcopal minister at Pine Ridge during Wounded Knee in 1890. So he was a young Dakota man, and he was there with another young Dakota man, Dr. Charles Eastman, who was a medical doctor. And those two were probably the first generation of Dakota men to go to college and on to get professional degrees. And they were absolutely traumatized by the experience. They rode out for 2 days in the blizzard looking for survivors. They turned my great uncle's church into a hospital. It was Christmas, so it was decorated for Christmas, and the big sign that said, "Peace on earth, goodwill for men." And so, but of course, their own people were dying, and women and children and elders, and so he died a few years later, and my grandmother always said he died of a broken heart. And so I think the stories our communities have and our relationships to land, the struggle to stay ourselves and stay intact is so interesting. So I actually, I might just, maybe I'll just do a little bit of my, I'll do a reading. The reading is a little unusual. I chose to do a reading sort of looking at, one of the things that really struck me was was the fact that when I was doing my research, I remember I'd originally written about Cliven Bundy, the father of Ammon, and Ryan Bundy, back in 2014 for the Nation magazine. I did an article, a piece about how Cliven Bundy was saying he had these ancestral rights to the land there in Nevada, and of course I had to write a piece challenging that notion, and I contrasted his approach to that of what was going on. One of my dad's cousins, she was very active against the Keystone Pipeline, and I just attended. She worked collaboratively with. They created this Cowboy and Indian Alliance, and the tribes worked collaboratively with the white landowners in South Dakota and Nebraska to fight the pipeline, which was an eminent domain sort of situation, and so it was sort of a different. I mean, the question always is, can the land make us relatives to each other, Jimmy? Can our relationship, our shared relationships to the land make us relatives, make us, and in the Dakota way, my grandmother's Aunt Ella DeLoria, she was an ethnologist and linguist, and she studied under Franz Roas at Columbia University, and she was a fluent Dakota and Lakota speaker. And she often wrote about the role of kinship in our society in making the sort of what she saw as the ideal society, the ideal people, that our way of life, she called it a way of life that worked, was within the camp circle society, the circle of teepees, which they called Tioshbaya, where everyone was related, everyone was had obligations to each other. Everyone could be dependent on as a human being because they had certain roles in these kinship relationships. So that's sort of can we achieve that today? Is there a way, where we can trust each other, we can be there for each other? And of course, that's sort of, the dream of any human society, really. And so I put this together. There's the Bundy standoff versus Standing Rock, and sort of contrasting the two different events. So looking at the Bundy takeovers, how the focus is on exercising our constitutional rights. We won't leave until these lands have been turned over to their rightful owners. More than 100 ranchers and farmers used to work this land, which was taken illegally by the federal government. And of course, here is referring to the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, and saying it's been destructive to the people of the county and to the people of the area. And then, of course, his father saying, I don't recognize the United States government as even existing. And so this is this is a quote from Dave Archambault, who was the Standing Rock Sioux Tribal chairman during the No Dapple standoff. And then he says, for centuries this government has built infrastructure projects off the backs of indigenous people, off the backs of tribes, and our tribe that's part of the great Sioux Nation. And we gave a lot to this nation. We've given our Black Hills that had gold. We've given our lands for farming and agriculture. We have given our river bottoms. The dams have flooded for energy independence, for hydropower. So for years, all of these takings have happened, and it has been at our expense so the nation can benefit. This is another example of oil pipelines coming through with crude oil, and if anything happened with this pipeline, who would pay the cost? Who would be the first ones to pay the cost? And again, it's our people. And so we are the first occupants of this country, of this nation, and forever, time and time again, we pay the cost for everybody. I can't believe it. So I think the understanding for the first time has been realized by these nations' leaders, and it took a lot of courage for them to take a look at the existing laws and really understand it. So this, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe is one of many Sioux tribes, or Dakota or Lakota tribes in the Dakotas and Montana and Nebraska and Minnesota, they say there's 7 council fires, the Ocheti Shako, and the Yanktons are one, the Hunkpapa, which were led by Standing Rock, are members of the Tetons Council Fire, and so he's referring to that, and then the flooding was, of course, the flooding done along the Missouri River, which flooded primarily Indian farmland in the 1950s, and actually flooded the village where my dad's family came from. So,
I ran a youth center south of their Cheyenne River Reservation, and they had stories of people in their homes that refused to believe that the flooding was going to happen, and so they're in their homes while the flooding is happening.
yes, yeah, my dad was a young boy, and he was on horseback with other boys from the reservation, and they were watching as their church, the Episcopal church, was being moved by the Army Corps of Engineers, and they said they could hear kind of screaming inside, like, you know, the spirits. And then later in 2000, my grandmother took part in a sort of a Standing Rock type camp where they refused to leave because the Army Corps had lowered the water level and some of the graves had come up. So they claimed they had moved the graves, but they hadn't moved all the graves. And of course, these are our own family members from the White Swan community there. And so my grandmother and other elders they refused to leave so that they wouldn't raise the water back up until they did something about it. And my grandmother used to say, like, so the young guys, some young sort of agents came and they wanted to, you know, they were ordering her friends off. They're all really elderly people, women. And she's like, what are you going to do? Arrest us? And she, like, held up her hand, like, arrest me. And he was like, oh, he didn't arrest her. But yeah, so it's always been a struggle, you know. Okay, so so sovereign citizen versus sovereign nation. Did I skip anything, or is this the next one? So yeah, so one of the things I wanted to really get at in the book was the sort of notion of colonial, being a colonist versus being a native person, right? And why are they so different? Why do these two perspectives have such different outcomes vis-a-vis the land, vis-a-vis, you know, our relationships to each other, and so colonial roots versus a real people. And in a lot of our languages, our word for ourselves is the people. You know, like my mom's people, they don't call themselves, well, they do call themselves Navajo, but our original word for ourselves is Diné, the people. And the U.S. begins primarily with a financial incentive driven by colonial interests, corporate origin of colonies, and land speculation by founding fathers. And then a people story begins with a transformative contact with a spiritual being. In this case, like my father's people, it would be the white buffalo cattleman, and original instructions. And so it's, I think the way, so I understood what a colonist was. It's pretty simple. You know, they go to other people's lands, they occupy it, and they send the wealth back to their ruling class, to their 1%. That's pretty much, you can predict what a colony is going to do based on this sort of very simple algorithmic paradigm. And then, but a people, I couldn't figure out how to summarize what it is to be a Native people. And then I found a quote from my grandma's cousin, Vi Delory Jr., where he talks about a people, like in a capital P. And it's a people are, you know, basically we have this relationship to the land, and that we are made a people by the land, our relationship to the land. And to what he said was a spiritual being who's a manifestation of the land, like the white buffalo cattleman, who is a manifestation of the Great Plains itself. And my grandma's, another one of my grandma's cousins, my great uncle, he used to say, we were not Lakota until we met the white buffalo cattleman. Before that, we were something else entirely. But once we met, then we became Lakota. You know, then we became this people that we are today. And so it's in those relationships. And when we met her, she came bringing the pipe, the chopas, you know, and it was made with the front leg bone of a bison, of a buffalo. And then we smoked it. We made this agreement with her, with the land, and all the peoples on the land already. And so we have a relationship with them. It's not about, we come here, we own this land, and now we can exploit it as we want to, as it's profitable for us. So it's a really different concept. So sovereign citizens versus sovereign nation. So a lot of present, like tribal Native American sort of focuses on sovereignty, on our political status as sovereign nations that pre-exist to the United States and that persist politically. And so we haven't gone away, we haven't disappeared as political entities, as nations, and we still are here, and so we really want the United States to engage us on that level. And it's difficult. In 2017, I went to the UN and interviewed a lot of tribal leaders, and that was the one thing they kept bringing up, was that they aren't able to sit at the UN as a representative of their own government. They have to go with an NGO. And some of them actually refused to come while they were actual tribal leaders because they had that principle, they wanted to come as a tribal leader, not as being hosted by an NGO. So sovereign citizen, so there's this invented legal history about the sheriff and the county having ultimate authority, and I was quite curious about this, and so that's why I did some of this research on English history, on English common law, on the Enclosure Acts. I was surprised to find out that most English people don't own their land, and also in Scotland, it's all still in the hands of the descendants. I mean, not all of it, but a good chunk of it is still 1,000 years later in the hands of the descendants of William the Conqueror and his friends. Like, the Normans came from France. I guess they were originally Vikings from Denmark, and they came and they basically, they killed 90% of the Anglo-Saxon nobility. Like, they just murdered them. And then, so it really was, and there's a whole song about the British people not being slaves, Hail Britannia, and but yet, they haven't owned their own country in a really long time, and in fact, they had very little land ownership. Even today, if you were to buy a house in London, you probably wouldn't be buying the actual land. You'd be buying the house, and then the noble family that owns that whole area of London would still keep the land. You're just, yeah, and so it's so there's very little land ownership in England, and actually very little representation at the time. There were a lot of these things like rotten boroughs. The whole cities in England didn't have representation even well into the 1800s. Manchester and Liverpool, they didn't have any representation in the Parliament. I mean, this idea that no taxation without representation, it was really not. I mean, most English people did not have representation. They had no voice about taxation. So it's kind of a spurious argument. I get into a bit more about the Revolutionary War, re-examining its origins. And so sovereign citizen, sheriff, county, ultimate authority, and that is simply not historically accurate at all either. Treaties are proof of status of sovereign nations, and then the sovereign citizen use of constitution to support claims of federal overreach. But their definition of the Constitution is a little different than what you would probably use legally. And then sovereignty preexists, persists, U.S. federal relationship. So this constitutional law thing, I don't know if you've probably heard about it. It's a pretty, that the sheriff is the only elected law enforcement official in America. The sheriff has the ultimate authority and within the county itself to interpret the Constitution. And also that this Clive and Money described how it was like this old Anglo-Saxon tradition of electing the sheriff. He was the representative of the Anglo-Saxon people. This whole kind of invented history and common law. And but when I did look into the history of the sheriff, it does not have that history at all. It's completely different than that. And the sheriffs were appointed by the noble. By the basically the Norman conquerors, they appointed them, so it's not all like that. But so some more quotes from Bundy. He asked his local sheriff to arrest BLM officials who were rounding up his cattle, but he directed his new message to every county sheriff in the United States. And I think that kind of thing is still going on, obviously, with I think that Trump himself has made calls to these sorts of groups and to stand up for him if he loses the election. So I think it's a lot. I think that's whatever. But yeah, this is the first article I wrote back in 2014 for The Nation about it. Of course, it's the Shoshone and the Paiutes, I should say, and the Utes. And so some other articles I wrote about this. Once again, looking at tribes' unrecognized sovereignty, treaties are only entered into between sovereign nations. I mean, under international law, you can't even enter into a treaty unless you are a sovereign nation, right? I was covering this one story where the Penn Museum of the University of Pennsylvania was actually entering into treaties with all these fake tribes. I mean, a museum and people who are pretending to be Indian making treaties, it just completely twists the idea of what actually we're talking about when we're talking about treaties and our rights under treaty. So the U.S. Senate only ratifies treaties with other sovereign nations, thus recognizing nationhood of our nations, although our nations pre-existed U.S. treaties. Signing a treaty is an act of sovereignty, and under international law, you cannot treaty away your existence. Anything not specifically mentioned in a treaty are retained rights or remain with the tribe. So if they don't specifically give something up, they still have it. So, and in fact, the state of Nevada was actually never given up by treaty at all. So it's kind of they just gave them the right to travel through the Oregon Trail. That's one of the things. So looking at, some of these, I don't know if you remember this, but the kind of the map of what was going on there. Of course, the Great Sioux Nation refers to not just the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, but all of the different Dakota and Lakota bands. And more about that. Here's all the larger picture of the transition home. And two photos. I actually ended up buying the poles to set up that teepee. My dad's tribe had their own camp there at Standing Rock, the Yankee Sioux tribe, and they brought this teepee and with the 7 council fires on it, but they didn't have poles to erect it, so I ended up buying them and bringing them over there, from Cheyenne River, from their camp. Yeah, so, and you see a lot of the different flags from different tribal nations. And I was standing there by camp, and a bunch of young people came up, and they were, shouting, "Water is life," coming from Cannonball, which is the nearest town on the reservation there. And it was just really moving and beautiful to see them doing that. So, this might actually be a good way to segue into my reading. So privatization, different relationships in land include privatization, public lands versus sacred lands, right? And a pro-privatization stance can be traced to the individualistic nature of the promise of the American dream. I do give in the book some history of privatization that had occurred previously for Malheur, which, and then Bundy's claims to pre-existing ownership of the BLM land is false. The Bundys claim that they owned the land before the BLM existed, but they actually purchased the land after the BLM was organized. If they didn't purchase their ranch, which is only 180 acres. You have to realize in the desert it takes 100, in that area, 100 acres to raise 1 cow. So they leased a lot of land from public land and to raise their cattle, but they didn't buy the 180 acres until the 1950s, I think. So like after the BLM was created, so fairly late. Privatization, governmental power is given to the Dakota Access Pipeline, reduces oversight and leads to destruction of sacred sites. Definition of the destruction of sacred sites happened both, at Standing Rock, of course, when the tribe filed an injunction to try to stop the pipeline. They filed it on a Friday, and so on the Saturday, the pipeline builder read the request for an injunction, and it had in there the location of the sacred sites. And then so they immediately brought a bulldozer over there and just bulldozed them over the weekend. So by the time the judge was going to review it on Monday, the sacred site didn't exist anymore. So sharing the locations of those sites is very problematic, while trying to preserve them. So this is sort of the history of, you probably know this history about the death of Mr. French, where the people felt that they were being oppressed by a large landowner from a corporation in Northern California, owning a lot of the ranch land around here, including a lot of the stuff around Mount here, and they actually, I guess, murdered the guy. And but anyway, that's part of the. So, I was trying to show that Ammon's history is actually not accurate. Privatization didn't actually make it more accessible. And so, one of the things I don't know if I have it on here, but about the Revolutionary War. Oh, this is so I got to interview my Desert Partnership folks. Burns Patron person. Let's see if I can have the. For the stuff about the Revolutionary War. Oh gosh, let's see here. Oh, this is my great aunt, Ella Deloria, in her clothes. This is a quote I wrote about people sharing the image of people who had died at Wounded Knee, the first Wounded Knee, of their frozen bodies and stuff like that. And it's just quite disturbing. But okay, this is the part of it. So looking at the Revolutionary War, we often think of it as being about, we have a certain sort of way of understanding it, but there's elements of it that I think have been really glossed over. I think, I don't know if you've seen, but a lot of Native people were wearing T-shirts that had a quote from the Declaration of Independence, which is like merciless Indian savages, right? That's how we're referred to in the Declaration of Independence. And this is referring to, and actually if you read the proclamation, there's a lot of, the Declaration, there's a lot of stuff in there that is referring to the resolution of the French and Indian War, right? And historians often call the French-Indian War World War Zero. It was the first World War, right? And it sort of seems like George Washington may have started this World War, actually, when he was a young man, about 20 years old. He was put in charge of a militia and sent out by Virginia, by the House of Burgesses, and then he was told the French were sort of building forts along the Ohio River Valley. So it was a fight for the Ohio River Valley. At the time, Virginia and a lot of other colonies had in their charter from the British Crown rights to, like, we go all the way to some of them, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So they have claims to the Ohio River Valley, and so the French were trying to shore up their claims by building forts, and so they sent George Washington out there to western Pennsylvania to basically assert Virginia's rights, and challenge the French. And he went there, and it kind of just totally fell apart. He basically ended up having to, the French won. They had an incident with the French, and then he had to sign a letter in French, which he couldn't read, where he took responsibility for the death of a French diplomat. And this death of the French diplomat is what caused the World War incident to happen. And one of the things that we talk about land is that there was a real hunger for land, right? And I think but with the resolution of the French-Indian War, you have this proclamation line of 1763 that King George III agreed to, and basically the Appalachian Mountains was that line. And the British colonists were not allowed to go past that. Everything west of there was Indian territory, And so a lot of New York State, a lot of western Pennsylvania, and you see Kentucky and West Virginia, and all of those places, western North Carolina. These are all that are places they cannot settle. And what I found was that all the founding fathers were investors in land companies, right? And I think the corporate nature of colonization, we often don't really talk about that. We do kind of. I mean, all of the, the Crown, the English and then the British Crown could not afford to fund colonization on its own, right? So they turned to their subjects and then allow them to form these corporations so they can share the risk, right, and the reward. And so you have a lot of the colonies being founded originally as corporations, right, that have rights. When I was covering the Keystone XL pipeline, I was interviewing a South Dakota rancher, and he was just completely shocked. He was like, I can't believe the U.S. government gave the rights of eminent domain, governmental rights of eminent domain to a Canadian company to come and take my land, right? And he was saying he could fight it, but he would just lose anyway, right? And I was looking at him, and I was just thinking, like, well, isn't that how this country was founded? I mean, by corporations, the Massachusetts Bay Company, the Virginia Company of London Adventurers, of course you have whole corporations taking over whole countries, like in India, you have, the East India Company, and the Hudson Bay Company, all these companies that were really the ones that sort of were made colonization possible. And with the original even the Mayflower Compact was only signed by shareholders, it's a corporate document. Do you mean it's sort of like we have to think about that? And I was just thinking like, don't you know the history of this country? You know, and so here you have the founding fathers being investors in land companies like the Ohio Land Company. In fact, you know, George Washington, after the French and Indian War, he bought up all the land, the Ohio Valley land rights that were issued to his soldiers. So he owned he owned a lot of acreage in Ohio, which of course the point was Indian land, right? And so this is what they're talking about when they're mad at King George III, that he's enforcing this because it cost them a lot of money. The French and Indian War doubled the national debt of both France and Britain, right? So in a way, and the land hunger of the English colonists was actually sort of a reverse taxation on their homeland. And then they refused to pay for the war afterwards. Like the colonies, different legislators, they refused to pass any taxation to pay for the war they started. And so that's why you have the Stamp Act. That's why the King George was trying to figure out ways to get them to pay for the war that they sort of started, right? And so this is what they're talking about. And they say King George III rose up savage, merciless Indian savages. Well, basically that he's protecting Indian land, and the soldiers being quartered and all that stuff are there to, there's not enough housing to house soldiers, but they're trying to make sure that they don't rush across the border and start another world war and once again tax their home country. Okay, so there's like a whole different side to that story that we often don't think about very much, And so this is more about. Oops, what happened? Oh, maybe I just ran out of space here. Okay, I guess let me get. So maybe that was it. Let me see. So anyway, so I'm going to read a bit. So I was very interested in the notion of the landlessness of colonists, where they were coming from, landless for generations, right? And so I thought I'd read a little bit about some of what I had read about it, and I thought it was kind of interesting history that gives an idea. Because, the Bundys, I did their tree, I did their genealogy, and they actually came to this country in the 1600s to North Carolina as Quakers. Yeah. And the Quakers in North Carolina, they actually lost their right to vote because they opposed slavery. So it's pretty ironic that their descendant would be talking, about how great slavery, that whole thing that happened. The Bundys and their followers invoked the importance of land ownership in their social media posts and statements to the press during the two standoffs with federal law enforcement and afterward at their trials and public appearances. They rely on catchphrases derived from Jeffersonian, Lockean words and concepts to express these God-given rights encoded in what Clive Bundy calls natural law. Natural law may seem undefined and pliable, that is, whatever Bundy may need it to be, still it does have central tenets that he repeats, often while referring to himself in the third person. To understand these planks of Bundy philosophy, some examination of the history of inequality and land rights of the real homeland of Bundy, Jefferson, Locke, and the United States is necessary. As you may have guessed, their real homeland is not America or in this hemisphere, but a tiny island nation called England. In the period leading up to the 13 colonies, so I talked a bit about the issue of so I go into a bit the Civil War, the English Civil War, and of course a lot of the folks in Massachusetts were for the parliamentarians. So like Harvard's first graduating class actually went back to England to fight against the King of England. Yeah, a little bit of history to but yeah. I joined the New Model Army with the Roundheads based on meritocracy. All right, so I talked about sort of the radicalization from England with different pastors that were preaching these things. And so the political outcomes of the English, so anyway, I said these were the key political arguments that laid the groundwork for the American Revolution, so which was 100 years later, right, or so. The political outcomes of the English Civil War also laid the foundation for the expectations vis-a-vis the crown, henceforth based not on a doctrine of absolute power given by God, but in a constitutional monarchy empowered by Parliament. As progressive as that political development might have been, what drove English colonists to these shores seeking opportunity and a reprieve from inequality remained a factor in most of the population's lives. The issues that drove the English people to revolt against their king were not just religious, despite the Puritan leadership, but were based on rights to the land on an island nation. The land rights movement that fueled the Civil War can be seen in the campaign and eloquence of the Digger movement in rural England. The Diggers of Warwickshire issued a proclamation in 1607, "We, as members of the whole, do feel the smart of these encroaching tyrants, which would grind our flesh upon the whetstone of poverty and make our loyal hearts to faint with breathing, so that they may dwell by themselves in the midst of their herds of fat castrated rams." So, this ancient social history of inequality and landlessness is encoded in the meaning of the Bundy surname itself. While watching television interviews with Cliven Bundy conducted in the living room of his humble ranch home during the 2014 Battle of Bunkerville, I spied a plaque hanging on the wall that reads, "Remember what the name Bundy means." I am unclear as to what the Bundys believe the meaning to be, but one meaning given for the surname Bundy is that it comes from the word bond, as in the oaths given by bondsmen to their liege lords. The name Bond, as in James Bond, also has this root meaning. In Anglo-Saxon England, a man's bond was his promise to obey the lord of the manor in exchange for the right to farm a portion of the lord's land. After 1066, under Norman rule, this is alleged to have become serfdom, and Bundy came to mean bound servitude. A chief feature of the system was a lack of freedom of movement. A serf could not move to another county or a town or city without his lord's permission. The lord of the manor also had to be consulted before a serf could marry, change occupation, or sell personal items of any value. He was truly a bound man, or a bondsman, unable to leave the plot of land that he was bound to by birth and an oath that may have been taken generations before by a distant ancestor. In contrast to Bundy's romanticized vision of this past filled with rural English yeomen farmers, their common law rights to land and representation through the sheriff, this was a form of ownership of his person that came with ownership of the land. The likelihood of escape was low. Freedom from the bond was possible only through manumission, enfranchisement, or escape. So when a lord inherited the land, they inherited Cliven and Ammon Bundy's ancestors. The land and the Bundys were one. Both were regarded as the personal property of the lord, not property owners. I present this surname history mindful of the limitations of knowing with certainty the history of many surnames that arose in a mostly pre-literate era. I offer this primarily to illustrate the genuine and changing constraints feudal systems in England and Europe placed upon liberty and, by extension, the potential of their citizens to own property, or estate, as Locke puts it, or happiness, as Jefferson later elegantly rephrases. Even in this system, certain rights are recalled from more ancient times and may be asserted as a matter of extra-legal custom or manor law. One of these rights included the right to use common land, which, of course, Bundy refers to quite a bit, to graze animals, gather kindling or herbs, and raise vegetables. Access to the commons allowed peasants some measure of economic security and even limited financial independence from their betters, the landowners who ruled their lives. They hang the man and flog the woman, they steal the goose from off the common, but let the greater villain loose that steals the common from the goose. English folk poem, circa 1764. Preceding the dawning of the Industrial Revolution, the commons came under attack as large landowners sought to remove rural tenants and replace them with more profitable sheep. The closing of the commons and resulting homelessness also coincidentally served to help to drive rural people to the new industrial cities like Manchester and Liverpool, which were places that the Mormon Church went to recruit new members. And I actually reviewed some of the sort of the minutes and sort of diaries of some of these Mormon converts in, I think it was between it was Liverpool and Manchester, but they were so poor that they were starving even as they were trying to pool their resources. They're starving to death working at these factories. So, and I think when Utah was declared a state, like a third of the population was like born in England. Like they had really recruited a lot of people from very Dickensian situations. And where cheap labor was in great demand. Many peasants, given a choice, would prefer to remain in villages their ancestors had lived in from time immemorial, rather than go to work in dangerous, monotonous factories for meager wages. In fact, the term job originally was referring to sort of a criminal act, you know, and a kind of a way of disparaging this kind of work. The economic support provided by farming on strips of publicly shared agriculture land and access to traditional gathering sites and places to graze the family cow had been just enough to keep poor families alive for generation after generation, and allowed free time for a village life that included holidays and socializing. Jobs, on the other hand, often meant working under dangerous conditions for long hours with very little social safety net. Later initiatives to, quote, kill the Indian to save the man, closing the commons was often framed as a way to free the rural poor from a subsistence life that made them lazy, unproductive, and unmanageable. Our forests and great commons make the poor that are upon them too much like the Indians, being a hindrance to industry and our nurseries of idleness and insolence, said John Bellers, a Quaker economic thinker and close friend of William Penn. The privatization of the commons transformed rural England. Many hedge tourists today admire when they tour the quiet rural lanes of the English countryside were planted at this time and cut off access to what had been for centuries public lands. Parliament passed over 5,200 lands to enclose more and more land, culminating in the Enclosure Act of 1801. Village after village was leveled as enclosure spread across the countryside. It was both impractical and expensive to fence the narrow strips granted to individual farmers to farm. You had to be able to pay to enclose the land in a fence to keep it, you know. And so the law favored the wealthy who could afford to build fences or to plant massive hedges around large areas. All told, is estimated some 6.8 million acres were enclosed. And then, this is a bit long, I'm sorry, but I have to talk about this guy, he's pretty fascinating. A leader of the fight against enclosure during the reign of King James I, John Reynolds, was fantastically named Captain Pouch. He would not have been out of place at the Bundy occupation of Malheur, raised as it was with the presence of a Captain Moroni. According to records in the time, he attracted huge crowds, 3,000 protesters in Warwickshire, 5,000 in I'm sure it was pronounced Leicester. Leicester. Reynolds was called Captain Pouch because of the large leather pouch he wore, where he maintained had a magical power that would defeat all opposition. In June 1607, he led 1,000 protesters, including women and children, who gathered in Newton to stop an enclosure in Rockingham Forest in the county of North Hampshire. A local nobleman, Thomas Tresham, was enclosing the Brand, a part of the forest that had been historically held in common for use by the community. Emboldened by Pouch's claims that he had the authority of the king and the Lord of heaven to destroy all enclosures, and the contents of his pouch would protect them, peasants began to pull down hedges and fill in ditches. After local militia refused a call-up, noblemen were forced to arm their own servants to put down the revolt. A royal proclamation from the king was read twice, ordering the end of the riots, and a pitched battle ensued that ended with 40 to 50 of the rebels massacred. The leaders, including Reynolds, were hanged and quartered. It was one of the last times the peasantry and gentry were in open armed conflict in England. The infamous pouch was recovered after the battle was found to contain only a piece of cheese. So, yeah, but it just shows, I mean, this is where most Americans, you know, I would say of European descent, not just English, but this is what they were coming from. And to be given access to all this land, I think that we don't often think about that, you know. Obviously, many people, you know, and then you contrast that relationship of being property with the land of another human being versus the kind of relationship indigenous people have, which is just directly, you know, our humanity and who we are is made by our relationship to the land, you know, and so it's just a real contrast. And I believe that these two different systems and these two different relationships have, you know, cascading effects, and I think you see that with climate change. And so I feel like, you know, when I talk about these different algorithms, you know, the algorithm of colonialization and the algorithm of, you know, being a real people, I do feel like there has to be some sort of from to marry. I don't know. And my husband is, my mother-in-law is Mohawk and Seneca and from Six Nations. And And they had a wampum that they had, a treaty they had made with the Dutch, and it's called the two-row wampum. And on that wampum you see the two lines, one representing the Dutch ship and then one representing the Iroquois Haudenosaunee canoe. But they're side by side, they don't cross, but they each maintain their space. So it's, I don't know if that's a solution, but it does seem like that there's just, and really what I love about and I talk about, because it's about Standing Rock too, my Aunt Ella's writing is that she really, in her ethnological work, she really sought to explain what it was about our traditional societies that worked, that made such wonderful people. And so, and you can see the deep stress that people were under in feudal societies where there was so much inequity and struggle. I mean, it's pretty shocking to see people, reading about people's lives, who are actually, starving to death. What they did was after they made these people homeless through the Enclosure Acts, they criminalized their homelessness. And then they put them in workhouses, entire families, and they had to work for almost nothing, and including 4 factories. And so it was just a system of funneling them in, dispossessing them of their lives and their culture, really. I mean, their culture was in those villages, And so, yeah, I don't say that, I mean, I just really had to grasp, I really wanted to engage the Bundy's ideology and really look at their history.
So you think it's more like control? What I'm hearing is everything is about control.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
People controlling land, controlling all that is around them.
Yeah, and I feel like what the Bundys were fighting for was their right as colonists, to what they believed that they had, that's where their rights come from, right, is colonization and occupation. And just the way in which they were ignoring how it impacted real Native people, whether it's here or whether it's, in Nevada where, they opposed, in addition to the Bears Ears National Monument, there was the Gold Butte made there right outside, well, actually within the area where they range their cattle, and they opposed that, And in fact, and then even in San Juan County, they got together with the county leadership there, together with Phil Lyman, who is now, I think he's a representative, he's running for higher office now, but he they got on ATVs and basically went over ancient Pueblo villages, because they said that they didn't have the right to say they couldn't ride there and stuff, so they had to ride over, several thousand-year-old villages just to prove their rights, So it's obvious that they don't, they did want to come to Standing Rock. They did approach the tribal leaders there because the Bundys wanted to come and support Standing Rock. And luckily they weren't allowed to come. But yeah, it just shows the way in which they really don't understand what I don't know. They don't understand the nature of what they're asking for in some ways.
So do you think that because of, you have the Europeans, the colonists that came in, they come from a place that was just desolate. They come from a place where everything was taken from them. So they come over here with that mentality.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's built, I think that things are systemic. That's what I was trying to get with the algorithm.
Right.
I kind of view algorithms as like if-then statements, if this, then that, right? And so it's, so when you have this, they came here to basically make a profit. These were corporations. I mean, working on, I did go to Jamestown when I was working on this book. I spoke at the College of William and Mary, and I went to Jamestown, and they actually, because it was a corporation and they weren't making enough money, they actually chained people to their beds to try to make them make more money, the guys in London, right? And it was, I mean, because some of these were younger sons of lords that came out and they weren't interested in doing any work at all, and so they actually chained them to their beds to try to make them work.
So to figure out, when you ask the question, to figure out how can we come together and live together as humans and not separate. And I think that's where we are now, is we consider ourselves separate. And, you know, with the non-Indians, you know, whether they realize that there is that guilt, shame, blame, and the Native people who have the blame, you know, and the same things, like these are two people that carry something that is happened a long, long time ago. You know, how are we going to heal from that? How are we going to get along? How are we going to bring it back together? How are we going to find that sacred light that we all have within us that has been through the teachings of our parents and our ancestors and whatever, that weren't so healthy way of thinking.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's trying to figure out how are they going to find that sacred light within them so that we can live as human beings and not carry all of this stuff that had happened that's a part of history, you know, how it still affects us. And the government doesn't help it because they know that as long as they can keep these people fighting amongst each other, they can do whatever it is that they're going to do, and we're still, you know.
Yeah, I think, you know, I actually do have in the part, oops. Oh, this is about, I'm sure, but I did have, in one of my articles and also in the book, there's a long discussion where she talks about going to the wildlife refuge, and the relationship that she was raised with that land. And, but yeah, which is what you're talking about, but I think that, I guess I'm a structuralist, you know, and I think that a lot of things are easier when there's a structure in place. And the problem often is that we're fighting against a structure. Mm-hmm. And so obviously we're all in these different places. I mean, like when I looked at the exit voting polls for when Trump was elected, you know, you have these rather astounding numbers. Something like 90% of white men without a college education voted for Trump, right? I mean, that means like 9 in 10, that's not an individual choice. I mean, it's, in a sense, it's structural. It's like where they are at, I kind of compare it to, you know, like a lab rat, you're in this maze and you're being directed which way to go. And that's sort of how the structure works. And these algorithms work to get you to a certain outcome. So I think that we have to have structural change. And years ago, going on 10 years ago, I wrote this article talking about sort of a federal indigenous government that would be a twin to the sort of colonial government, right? And you know, in our cultures, we often have twins, you know, like twin heroes. My mom's tribe, they have the, child born of water and monster slayer, the twins. They come in and they get rid of the monsters and they make the world, you know, in harmony and joie, you know, for the people. And so my husband's people, they have the story of the twins there too, you know. And so I kind of wonder, like, if we had, I sometimes, like, why are we so invisible to people? Why are we so unknown, right? I mean, you have people really attracted to, I think at the time I was running one about mascots, you know, Indian mascots, and why people were so, you wouldn't listen about how harmful they were. And then, of course, now you have the issue of a lot of ethnic fraud. You know, I think just a couple days ago, UCLA announced that a woman admitted she wasn't Cherokee, right? And so why do people think it's so easy to be Indian based on a family story, right? When it's really about your family's lived experiences, which you would know about, you know, wouldn't be a secret, you know. And so, but I mean, I think, so I think it's, so I was trying to think, why are we so invisible? And I think it's the political nature is often hidden, because our political nature is a direct threat to the U.S. government's claims of domination of this land and ownership. And as long as we exist as nations, we are a threat. And so there's this real sort of attempt to make that invisible. And when you are colonized, everything about you is takeable, consumable. And I actually came across this idea because, well, my husband, his father's half Finnish, and so his grandmother is Finnish American, and she was telling us about how when she was growing up in Waukegan, Illinois, she had to go to Finnish language class after regular school and learn to read and write in Finnish. And she said the reason was her dad's generation told them that when Finland declared its independence from Sweden, they were colonized by Sweden, and their language was outlawed, that they had to write their Declaration of Independence in Swedish, because they were illiterate in their own language. So the reclamation of their language, just as you see going on in Ireland with Gaelic, the reclamation of your children even, like children are being taken. I wrote this piece right after the Baby Veronica case where a Cherokee child was taken from her family, and the Supreme Court okayed it. And your culture, your identity, everything is assumed by the colonizer.
Well, it's like I'm from Yosemite, California.
Yeah.
That's Yosemite, Miwok, and Mono Lake Paiute. And they don't have any land. They were kicked out. They were chased out. They weren't given any land. There was a treaty, but it wasn't ratified.
Oh, yeah.
And they can't find it.
Of course.
So
they hit them all away.
I said, just give me Tuolumne Meadows, that's okay.
Yes.
But I mean, they're still fighting, my people are still fighting for recognition. And they had some signs changed up in Yosemite because my uncle and my cousins were standing there, and on one of the plaques up there it says the Miwok Nation is no longer. And they're standing there looking at each other going,
I know, here we are.
yeah, hey, are you real?
Yeah, I know.
So they had to fight to get that changed.
That's good.
Yeah,
Wow.
and it's still, we're still
Was it
fighting.
decided by the Park Service or something? Oh, geez.
And we're still fighting for recognition.
Yeah, I think, in California it's quite bad because the genocide was
I think they only had like one tribe in, I don't know how many, 50 years or something, that's been recognized.
Yeah, it's, I think, I'm actually writing an article about the marine sanctuary that's being going through Northern California and the Chumash Marine Sanctuary.
So it's real mind-boggling that, these, the power struggle that they think that we're going to take from them to, if we wanted our land back or if we just wanted something, reimbursement for the land, they're making millions and millions of dollars out of Yosemite.
Yeah.
And we, here are my people scattered all around.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I mean, it's really at different times from the Trump administration where now you have a Native woman who's been leading the Department of the Interior, Deb Holland, Laguna Pueblo. And then, of course, the head of the National Park Service is Chuck Sams, who is from, I think he's Warm Springs from Oregon, and also Yankton Sioux descendant. And it's just interesting to see what they might do with that. I did write an article about that, a couple articles about when he was sworn in. I didn't realize until I started working on the articles that one of my ancestors was born in Yellowstone National Park back in like 1800 or something. I don't know, our tribes used to really roam, that's a lot.
Well, the thing is, because I have family who are non-native. I have grandchildren who are non-native, and I have a good friend who's non-native. And when I bring up Native issues, I don't do it to make the non-natives feel guilty. That's not what I do. What I want to do is bring awareness to the situation and try to get their support on, not letting it continue with the behavior.
Yeah, I think that's what, so telling the history in a different way, particularly the Revolutionary War, the origin story of this country, I think is really helpful because if you don't have all the facts, you don't understand the situation you're in, right? Like, look at the poor rancher in South Dakota. Like, he had no idea that a Canadian company would have the rights of eminent domain over his land. And so it's or you're dealing with a lot of a system that you don't understand how it came about and why it's oppressive to certain groups. And so I think a better understanding of the Revolutionary War is essential to really change the way we understand why this country exists, right? I think I do refer to it as a colony because I feel like it's still a colony. I mean, it's not a nation is something where it's your land, but if you're occupying other people's land, it's and you haven't reached some sort of, I don't know,
And people can see it when it's not where they live.
Yeah.
Like there's very woke Americans about the Palestinian situation, but they don't see it applying here at all.
Yeah, it's I think also the issue, which I kind of used to some of the slides are doing with the issue of white privilege and white supremacy. I think in the treatment of different standoffs, and then I think also just the fact that it's really hard to get these. It's interesting how many people are actually convicted when they storm the Capitol if they're white, or the Malheur thing. How many of them actually got convicted? It seems like, and I sat through some of the cases here in Portland, and it's just like, I just, it's sort of, it's their law. And I think looking at the county level, that's something I get to a lot in the book as well, is how much of these different fights were occurring at the county level. Whether you're talking about Harney County, which is, it's the size of New Jersey or something, it's huge, or San Juan County in Utah, which is, I think, also the size of New Jersey. These massive counties. And then you have Morton County in North Dakota, where you're dealing with the sheriff, you're dealing with the county gentry, you're dealing with these folks who have, and I had never really thought about the level in which having access to universal power, even at the county level, how much kind of power it gives certain families and access and everything, and they understand how the system works. Even if they're living in a rural community, they have a direct connection to the state legislature, they have a direct connection to different things, which I think, coming from Native families, I just had never really realized, because all four of my grandparents they're Indian, and all 8 of my great-grandparents are Indian. So we didn't really have that kind of relationship to the colonial governmental system. But really looking, especially when I was covering the Bears Ears thing, I learned a lot about that system where they had all kinds of ways to basically extract money and for their schools, but not for Indian schools. If you go to San Juan County, the white part is perfect, everything's perfect. They have perfect communities, and then you go to the Navajo part. The Navajos are the majority numerically in the county. They don't have dirt. They have dirt roads. They don't have anything. And some of my family is from Navajo Mountain, which is part of the area. And it's just really, it's the have and the have-nots are very clearly laid out, just in that. And then, well, of course, for a lot of Navajos I spoke to who went to Standing Rock, they were shocked to the level of racism in North Dakota against Indians. They said they hadn't felt that really before. They felt like it was worse in North Dakota and stuff. So, you look at the state like South Dakota, which has some of the highest levels of people being able to change their economic status. Their economic mobility rate is very high, right? But for the white community, right, and not for the Indian community, And my dad's community is in a really tough place, really high levels of drug addiction, meth. It's bad, and I don't really. It's very, I do write about the issues that try to get attention to it, because often communities like the Yankton Sioux tribe are completely overlooked. Like Pine Ridge gets a lot of eyes on it, but the Yankton Sioux tribe, most people don't even know it exists. Andes, what's that? But so I did do some articles about the flooding there, and then when I was covering the flooding, because everyone was focused on Pine Ridge being flooded, but no one noticed that my dad's hometown had been underwater for 8 months, and it was like E. coli in the water, and the kids were getting MRSA, and people had pumps in their basements, and they had to repaint the houses numerous times because they had mold and peeling, and they had to buy all new furniture, replace their car twice in 1 year, because they don't have four-wheel drive, so when the roads got washed out, they were on these, ruining their suspension, and these are poor people, these are people living in HUD housing. And so I wrote an article about that, and I was able to get FEMA to come out finally and give them money, and I got some of the tribal leaders to help out. But so many of our people, they suffer completely invisible, and I don't think that things have gotten better. I think in some communities things have gotten worse. Like interviewing folks are like, oh yeah, it's got 50, 60% drug addiction here.
I think people have just become so desensitized to.
Yeah.
It's just like, walking past a homeless person, you just.
It's hard when it's in your community. I mean, it's just so hard, and it's just so heart-rending for me to hear those figures, and talk to people there, and because they're my cousins and they're my relatives, and they're living in poverty, and what's the way out, so. Any other questions?
You're based here in Oregon?
Yes, I live in Portland.
I was wondering if you could talk more about the bridge between the colonizer and the native relationship to land, or the idea of them running parallel, or having a federal native government and a federal colonial government. Because I think it's just hard for me to envision when it seems like one of those ideologies is so destructive to the other, and always kind of has an incentive to undermine the other.
Yeah, it's always, sovereignty is such a double-edged sword. I mean, look at Haiti, right? They got their sovereignty, but, they're just, been made to hurt for so long, but I think, my idea was that with a political reality made much more clear to other Americans that we would be more real. If you knew that this was our country, that even if it was an archipelago of reservation lands that was our country, you would know that we exist as a country. And some tribes, like my husband's tribe, actually issues its own passports to travel, and they have their own internationally winning lacrosse team, and the whole team travels on their passports, on the Haudenosaunee passports internationally. Of course, the United States and Canada tries to stop it, tries to not let them go to certain events and not have their passports honored, right? And so, but they're within their rights to issue their own passports. But I think that my idea was that the creation of an indigenous federal government, I think some people started calling it FIG, federal, would be that it would make us more visible, make us more real, and then maybe we could and make the definition, the relationship, give it a different kind of focus, right? That we would be the beneficiaries of any treaty the U.S. signed. Our passports would be just as powerful as the U.S. passport. Do you mean? And just kind of in a way be like a twins, having that sort of being unified but separate. Do you mean? But yeah, it does. I think there is a generation growing up that will have a very different perspective. But I think kind of thinking different ways that we can manage the relationship, and I do believe that it's structural. I respect Deb Holland a lot, but it has to be tough to be a Native woman on top of an organization that has such a different history and really a different focus. And
I feel so disappointed by her. She seems pro-mining company,
Oh yeah, it's just I just don't even know. As a kid, I grew up saying Pledge of Allegiance without thinking, right? And now I think, God, I don't even know if I would want to run for office. I don't think I could do that. Do you know what I mean? I can't. But it's just I think it's pretty tough. I have those are ideas I developed 10 years ago, and of course, but it's I do think it's something that needs a lot more attention. Like, how do we marry these two? How do we make it so that it's not one or the other, right? Maybe not one or the other. How do we maybe give them a relationship to them? That's kind of what I went through in my first article about the land making a people one people, in the nation, was the sort of the way in which sorry, these photos are a little alarming. Let's see here. Maybe I didn't. I'm sorry. But yeah, it was like, because the relationship to land is what brought the Cowboy and Indian Alliance together, right? But once again, their relationships are different. The tribe's relationship is inherently different than that of an individual landowner, right? And it's just a lot of this notion that actually driving here, I saw a sign supporting the Hammond family, I think I used to be the executive director of an organization called the California Indian Basket Weavers Association. So that's where I learned a lot about that issue, and the level of genocide that occurred, and there was just this really terrible, and some of it was pretty terrible what happened here. I mean, also here in Oregon we have a lot of these confederated reservations, which are basically the remnants of survivors. It's sort of a haunting name, and when we would do burn, we had biologists and stuff that we worked with that to do, cultural burns there's certain elements of basket weaving that you use fresh shoots for. So you need, to prune things. You need to, for the next season, so they'll grow, and you need also to burn. Tribes just don't burn. They work in collaboration and consultation with other agencies. What the Hammond said, from what I could read from the legal lawsuit, was that they did endanger fire workers because they were just burning without telling anybody, not working in concert with other groups. I mean, yes, they live on that land, they must know something about it, but you have to still work. You can't be endangering other people's lives. You have to talk to each other, And so I don't know their notion that what they, obviously, I don't know. It just seemed a little, interesting. But yeah, so. And I do have more about the Birds Pio people's perspective. I have a chapter on that, which I didn't read from because. I don't know, I feel like I often don't talk about Captain Pouch very much. I really don't talk about him. He's such an interesting character, we don't remember his history.
A little detail about English history that I wanted to know if you knew, because I have European descent and the genealogy. What is 100?
So, that was, so that's like a kind of where they used to organize, like, sort of.
Forest or something? I don't know what 100
I
is
think
when I'm doing
it's
research.
communities.
Okay.
Yeah, it's and in fact, I can't.
So it's not like a county, but it's like a grouping of people.
Yeah, it's sort of more of a land organization sort of thing. And when land was issued, even in Virginia, it was done by hundreds. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't understand what I'm reading because I'm like, I don't know what 100 is to know what.
It's an old,
Yeah.
But it's well, I think I'm a little bit English. I'm not sure. I don't know. Because you trace the tree back and suddenly it's like French Huguenot. I don't know. So, but I think I am part English. Well, actually, no, I am because my Keeler ancestors were German speakers. I don't know really where, but they went to Pennsylvania and they fought in the American Revolution. But they married into the Adams family so I am distantly related to President Adams because it's that Adams family. Yeah, and going back to Massachusetts. So it's a tiny amount of English ancestry. I guess that makes the Keeler thing makes me like a 30-second German speaker. I don't know where in Germany they came from, so German speaker. But yeah, so a tiny amount.
Sort of speaking to what Amelia said and what you brought up earlier about running things in parallel or finding ways, and how becoming visible is important. What sprung to mind is one of my great favorites is Aldo Leopold in Santa Caliana relates the story of the green-eyed wolf, which shaped his vision of looking at wilderness and wildlife as something inherently of value, and if you lose it, an essential character of the nation as a whole. So you need to develop a philosophy and a morality in order to encompass that wildness. And I think that it rhymes with what you're talking about.
Yeah.
That essentially now, for me, this is my own personal looking at it. Now I look at Indian nations as the green-eyed wolves, right? And you lose something essential.
Yeah, I think, what is the definition of wilderness, right? I mean, even for us, often the wilderness is managed.
Right.
I mean, through burning, through whatever, and so through even, sort of agricultural, sort of management, even in areas that appear completely wild, right? And I know that's a huge issue happening now, and with this, trying to save the sequoias, which are being burned by these super hot climate-driven fires. And some people are saying you shouldn't try to save them because wilderness, right? You're not supposed to get involved. But at the same time, the Indians are saying, well, we've always managed this. This has always been managed. It was managed when you got here. It wasn't. Well, what is wilderness?
Right. And that's the value that comes to it. If someone is in a position of influence who wants to shape a policy or shape how approaching things, and if they're not looking at the one who has feet on the ground, you're just not going to, you're going to end up with a disaster.
And I think we have to really, once again, think about the systems that we come out of. Because I think a lot of times we have a lot of assumptions and don't realize that, and it's playing into sort of, a lot of this divisiveness, I think, and particularly with the management of land and what it means to be, I guess, American maybe, and a lack of recognition of Native nations in our role, in our existence. So that's the main thing. My children are citizens of the Navajo Nation, and so, but yeah, I still feel very, connected to my dad's tribe and my family there, and my husband's people up in. They were his ancestor fought against the Americans in the Revolutionary War. His ancestor was Chief Joseph Brant. He was the Mohawk chief, and he sided with the British in the Revolutionary War because he understood that they were coming after their land. And they kind of explicitly said it in the Declaration of Independence. We want your land. We want upstate New York, and they got it. And they were sold out by the British in the treaty negotiations after the end of the Revolutionary War, and then they were given land, the Haldeman Tract in Ontario, and so that's why Six Nations is up in Ontario. But they were from upstate New York, and they lost their homelands there, and so that's part of their history. And I think that. Not having your homeland is such a painful thing. Like Navajo people, there was talk about when we were being held in a concentration camp. Not all of us. The Cameron, where my mom is from, is called the Undefeated. Like we were never defeated by the U.S. Army. We took refuge in Navajo Mountain. Undefeated, never defeated. But several thousand Navajos were held in a concentration camp called Bosque Redondo or Welde in Navajo, and some of my ancestors were held there. My Kiahani forebears, my great-grandmothers, came of age there, so for women. And but there was talk of moving them to Oklahoma, putting them up there, like they did with Geronimo's people,
Okay.
Yeah, and I just can't imagine we wouldn't be the same people if we had been moved to Oklahoma and lost our homeland. Like I said, the land makes us a people. So when the Navajos emerged from the third world into the fourth world, the holy people came to us, and they pushed the water aside. We call this the glittering world because it was covered in water, and the light was glinting off the waves. And they pushed it aside and gave us land to live on. And they gave us the corn, from the dawn. They gave us, we pray with the corn pollen, and gave us the songs to sing. We sing people into health. Our medicine men are called singers, atahli. So and the goal is to live in harmony, hojanasli, living everything beautiful, everything in harmony. When you pray about walking and moving. The language is very like that. And I think instead of putting on your pants in English, now it's like you move your body through your pants. It's just a different notion, and so it's but it's all about harmony. And I think it's a really different origin story from what you see in the Bible, where it's about punishment. You're being evicted from the Garden of Eden. There's punishment and there's guilt, and but here we emerged and then we were told how to live in harmony here, right? And then how we can maintain harmony. And so, but the Navajo way is it's our homeland, our Diné is between the 4 sacred mountains and the 4 sacred rivers, right? And that's our homeland. So when people were, my great aunt Tiana Big Horse, she wrote a book from my grandmother's grandfather's story about how he had fought under Chief Manolito when we were fighting the Americans. It's called Big Horse the Warrior, and he was from Mount Taylor, which is in New Mexico, which is one of the sacred mountains. And he said as people were leaving Queldeck, they were finally free. They believed that their prayers had freed them, right? And they were coming in, they saw this first sacred mountain, and the elderly people were so excited, so happy that they were dying of joy. Like they were just collapsing when they saw that sacred mountain, and because they were returning home, right? And so, I feel like you can't even be, Navajo without a homeland, right? I mean, you can, but it would be something completely different if we were to move to Oklahoma. Some of the first stories that I covered were about, the removal of different tribes, like Pennsylvania, all removed, both Delaware tribes to Oklahoma, and some of the remnant groups joined other remnant groups in Wisconsin, these brotherhood communities, and Brotherton villages, and yeah, it's just the removal from your homeland. I just can't even. I went to school in New Hampshire for college, and I'm walking around there, and it's just like in a graveyard. You see their place names of the people that aren't there anymore, right? It's just completely gone, and you think, wow, that could have been us. That could be, the Diné, the Lakota people, that could have been us. No one would miss us. No one, people are going about their business there in New Hampshire. No one misses them. No one thinks, it's just like, yeah.
Because their tribe got down to 300 to 400 people.
Yes, yeah.
That's that close to not existing.
Yes, I wrote about that. That was astounding, and I was so impressed by the tribal leadership, just the way in which, it's like, wow, I wish that we could get leaders like this in the Navajo.
It's like, the native people of this land have roots.
Yeah.
And when the colonists came over, they did. So my grandpa said they were lost because they don't have that root.
Searching for their tikva.
Yes.
They don't have the root of the land, so that, that created this.
Yeah, that's why I really focus on their the whole thing of the ownership of the land, which they were not allowed in England, right? And even in Scotland, and so what that sort of was their notion of how they would become fully people, right? Is through the ownership of the land, but that has a totally different sort of economics associated with it. Obviously, you have to make a profit. And of course that drives them to, enslaving, holding people in bondage.
Right.
And
yeah,
and just just really horrific things that were done to make it profitable, right? The profit margin issue is, and not to say that Native nations were not profitable, but or successful economically, but I think the kind of chasing that is really causing a lot of harm and to many millions of people. So my descendants just. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I feel bad I didn't read from more from. Yeah, I feel bad. It seems like I find it easily.
Well, they can bring Paiute people in here to speak.
Yeah.
I don't even see any.
Yeah, they're looking to us. So I do have a chapter here, Can the Land Make Us One People? So I kind of took it into that bit. So. I did have this quote. It's not from Paiute person, but thousands of floating islands between which flow narrow channels that are endless in their windings. The main body of the lake is still a mile beyond the place where the spring branch enters the Tule jungle. the tules grow from 8 to 12 feet high, so that when one enters the mass, he has no landmarks, unless perchance he can read signs in the heavens above. This is William L. Finley's account of Malheur Lake from the Trail of the Plume Hunter, 1910. That's also, I think it's in this chapter, I think I talk more about the Paiute perspective on it. So.
Okay.